Heart disease is still the #1 killer of both men and women in America. But doctors say many cases can be prevented. New cholesterol guidelines are encouraging people to get screened earlier and aim for even lower LDL levels before problems develop. A local cardiologist has what you need to know in today's Medical Monday. A heart attack or stroke can seem to happen out of nowhere, but doctors say the warning signs often start years before symptoms ever appear.
Coronary disease or cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death for men and women in America, and unfortunately may be on the increase due to lifestyle habits and things like that.
Smoking, diabetes, inactivity, poor diet, and family history all raise your risk. That's why doctors say prevention is more important than ever.
Go see your physician, go get regular checkups, know what your cholesterol is, what your blood sugar is, what your blood pressure is, because you can modify those risk factors to prevent a cardiovascular event later on down the line.
One of the biggest changes in the new guidelines focuses on lower density lipoproteins, or LDL, often called bad cholesterol. Experts now recommend screening start around age 30, especially for people with a family history of heart disease. And for high-risk patients, the goal is an LDL level below 55.
What we've learned is the higher your LDL, the longer you're exposed to high levels of LDL, which lead to things like heart attack and stroke. So we're trying to push those levels based on your risk factor under 100, and sometimes in some cases as low as 55 or lower.
If lifestyle changes aren't enough, there are more treatment options than ever before, including statins, non-statin medications, and newer injectable drugs for some patients.
The big overriding message is prevention now will prevent problems later.
Doctors say even if you feel healthy in your 30s or 40s, knowing your cholesterol numbers now could help prevent serious heart problems decades down the road. In Panama City, Alyssa Dutton, News Channel 7.
Medical Monday is sponsored by Cardiovascular Institute of Northwest Florida, providing nationally certified cardiovascular services right here at home.
Doctors say prevention starts long before symptoms appear, making regular checkups, healthy habits, and cholesterol screening some of your best tools for keeping your heart healthy.